Usually when we talk about a legal right, there's this expectation of, well, precision.
Yeah, like it's math or something.
Exactly, like engineering. I mean, you get a parking ticket, you look at the municipal code, and it shows this completely clear rule. And the judge just points to the text and says, well, there it is.
It is comforting. We really like things to be visible.
Right, to be perfectly categorized.
Yeah.
We want to believe that our rights are written down in stone or, at least on parchment, locked safely away in a glass case somewhere in Washington, D.C.
But then you step into the world of the First Amendment.
Oh, man, and suddenly that X-ray machine is completely broken. We are looking at a constitutional landscape that is just hopelessly murky. You might assume a right exists simply because a judge says so or because it was written down a couple of centuries ago. But today, we are going to challenge that assumption for you.
We really are.
We are jumping into this deep dive on a really dense, truly fascinating scholarly book. It's titled Eloquence and Reason: Creating a First Amendment Culture by Robert L. Tsai.
Such a good read.
It really is. And our mission today is to entirely dismantle the myth that the First Amendment is just a static piece of paper. We're going to explore how freedom of speech is actually this living, breathing, linguistic regime.
Right, meaning it is a set of vocabulary, metaphors, and cultural beliefs that ordinary citizens, meaning you, the listener alongside social movements and presidents and judges, are constantly rewriting and wrestling over.
But before we dive into the deep end of the constitutional pool here, we have to make a very important disclaimer to you about the material we are covering today.
Yes, definitely. So the source text we are analyzing examines the rhetorical strategies of various politically charged movements throughout American history.
Right.
This includes left-wing civil rights activists in the 1960s, as well as right-wing social conservatives in the 1980s and 90s. And we want to emphasize strongly that we are not taking any political sides here.
Not at all.
Nor are we endorsing the viewpoints of these movements or the author of the book. Our sole objective is to impartially report on and analyze the ideas, the legal theories, and the rhetorical mechanics contained in the original source material.
Exactly. We're just looking at how language is used as a tool, nothing more.
Just the mechanics.
So let's jump right in. To understand how we talk about our rights today, the book argues that we first have to completely discard some very old, very famous philosophical myths about where government even comes from.
Oh, the pre-political theories.
Right. We're talking about philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Robert Nozick, and John Rawls. I mean, whenever you take a Poli-Sci 101 class, these are the guys you are told to study, right, to understand the foundation of society.
Yeah, they are the absolute bedrock of Western political thought. I mean, Hobbes famously envisioned a state of nature where life was just nasty, brutish, and short.
Sounds fun.
Right. And he argued that society formed a government, a leviathan, just to escape the constant violence.
And then you have Locke.
Yeah, Locke, who imagined this moment of rational consensus where people willingly agreed to form a state specifically to protect their property and their labor.
Oh, okay, so that's property.
Then later on, you get Robert Nozick arguing for a night watchman's state, which is this idea that society is based on an original bundle of pre-political rights that act as absolute constraints on what government can ever do.
Of course, John Rawls gives us his famous thought experiment called the veil of ignorance.
Classic.
I remember the veil of ignorance from college. The idea is that you imagine building a society without knowing your own class, race, intelligence, or status within it.
Right. You are totally blind to your own future.
Exactly. Since you don't know if you'll end up being the richest person or the poorest, you will naturally design perfectly fair, equitable principles of justice to protect yourself just in case.
It is a beautiful piece of philosophy. I mean, truly. But Tsai basically calls all of these out as creation myths.
Creation myths, like folklore.
Basically, yeah. They're ancient origin stories that don't actually match the messy, lived reality of human beings. Tsai argues that these thought experiments are entirely front-loaded and totally unverifiable.
Because they never actually happened in history?
Exactly. They might be elegant on a chalkboard, but they completely fail to explain how modern democratic life actually works.
So it's like, if we base our society on the idea that our rights are just these end states that were decided perfectly at the beginning of time.
By hyper-rational actors in a state of nature, yeah.
Right. Then we strip modern citizens of their agency. We stop treating rights as an ongoing, living debate. And we start treating them as museum exhibits that we can only look at, but, never touch.
And the really critical flaw he points out with these theories is that they lack a transmission mechanism.
Explain that. What do you mean by transmission mechanism?
Well, think about it. Even if the founders of a nation somehow discovered the perfect eternal principles of justice and wrote them down, how do those principles get transmitted across generations without losing their meaning?
Oh, because language changes.
Exactly. Language naturally degrades and shifts over time. A word written in 1789 doesn't carry the exact same cultural weight in 2026. The pre-political theorists assume you can just freeze language and meaning in amber.
Which you obviously can't.
No, you can't.
So if looking backward at some mythical state of nature doesn't work, what does Psy offer as an alternative? Because he introduces this massive paradigm shift here.
It really does.
He says that instead of looking at democratic constitutionalism as a binding mechanical contract from the past, we need to look at it as a project of cultivating faith.
Faith.
Yeah. He explicitly argues that First Amendment law is best understood as a sophisticated system of devotional practices.
It's such a wild reframing. But he is tapping into a deep psychological truth about how societies hold together. Now, to be clear, he is not talking about religious faith in a deity.
Right, it's a civic faith.
A civic political faith. Freedom of expression isn't just a regulatory rule you look up in a book. It is a profound social commitment built on core precepts.
Like what?
Well, consider the belief that maximizing speech perfects democracy, or that a free society is measured by its tolerance of dissent. These operate exactly like articles of faith.
Because we can't prove them scientifically.
Exactly. We do not subject them to rigorous empirical scientific testing every single day. We accept them as the baseline conditions of being a citizen in this republic.
And Foucault is brought into the discussion here, which makes perfect sense.
Oh yeah, Michel Foucault.
He has this idea that vocabularies are monuments of thought. Meaning isn't found perfectly preserved in a text. It is actively generated by the vocabulary of the people.
And Tsai calls this rhetorical freedom.
Rhetorical freedom, I like that.
It's the citizenry's right to reimagine the past and reshape the grammatical arrangements of public debate.
Because the text of the First Amendment just says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech.
Right. But what does freedom of speech actually mean when a labor organizer wants to stand on a soapbox in a public park? Or when a teenager wants to post a controversial video online?
The text on the parchment doesn't tell you the answer to that.
No, it doesn't. To figure that out, you need rhetorical freedom. You need to look at how time, language, and culture constantly change constitutional meaning.
Let's look at a concrete historical example from the source, because I think this is where the theory really hits the pavement.
Yeah, let's do it.
We have two cases, separated by just a few decades, that perfectly show how the exact same constitutional text means two completely different things, depending entirely on the vocabulary the court chooses to use. Let's look at Boston in 1897.
Okay, the case is Davis v. Massachusetts.
Right.
This is a classic, really illustrative case. A street preacher named William Davis was arrested for speaking in Boston Common without a permit from the mayor.
Now, looking at this through modern eyes, you might think, well, it's Boston Common, it's a public park, of course he has free speech rights.
Right, that's our modern instinct. But in 1897, you have to remember the prevailing societal mindset. This was the Gilded Age. The dominant cultural and legal vocabulary was deeply rooted in private property rights and absolute ownership.
So when the Supreme Court looked at this case, they didn't see a free speech issue.
No, they utilized a very specific metaphor: government as private landowner.
The judge literally reasoned that for the legislature to forbid public speaking in a park is no more an infringement of rights than a homeowner kicking you out of their living room.
It's wild. By choosing that specific vocabulary, anthropomorphizing the state into a private, wealthy homeowner, the court completely subjugated the right of speech to the right of property.
The state had absolute control to exclude anyone for any reason.
Exactly. It wasn't that the judges misread the First Amendment. It was that the linguistic regime of the 1890s dictated that property metaphors were the most persuasive, logical way to understand government power.
But then society changes. We fast forward a bit to 1939, a case called Hague v. CIO. And the world is completely different now.
Completely. This is the New Deal era.
Right. We are out of the Gilded Age and dealing with the Great Depression. Labor unions are organizing massively. There is widespread activism in the streets, and people are fundamentally rethinking the role of government in everyday life.
The context has shifted massively, and so the vocabulary has to shift with it. In Hague, a workers' rights organization, the CIO, was denied a permit by the incredibly powerful mayor of Jersey City, Frank Hague.
Right. They wanted to hold open-air gatherings and distribute pamphlets.
Yeah. And Mayor Hague was basically using the Davis precedent, acting like he personally owned the streets. But this time, the Supreme Court read the First Amendment generously to protect the labor organizers.
And the fascinating part is how they did it.
Yes.
They didn't just say, oh, well, free speech wins now. They swapped the underlying metaphor.
Yeah.
They introduced the government as trustee metaphor.
Time out of mind. That's the famous phrasing they used. They said streets and parks have been used time out of mind for assembly and communicating thoughts.
By using the language of a trustee, the court framed the government not as a selfish, absolute landowner who can kick you off the lawn, but as a benevolent guardian.
Exactly. The state is charged with an ancient, sacred duty to preserve these sites for the true beneficiaries, which is the public.
They shifted the linguistic framework from absolute state power to state responsibility.
And that single rhetorical shift cracked open the door for the modern public forum doctrine. It laid the groundwork for protecting mass demonstrations, civil rights marches, and anti-war protests for decades to come.
Okay, hold on. I want to jump in here and really push back on this terminology for a second.
Sure.
Because if I am a lawyer walking into court tomorrow, hearing you call the First Amendment a faith or a devotion makes me incredibly nervous.
I get that.
I don't want to rely on a judge's spiritual feeling or cultural vibe about my case,
Yeah.
I want hard, objective rules. I want precedents.
Right, you want a formula.
Yes. Doesn't calling it a civic religion inherently diminish its actual hard legal authority? Doesn't it make the Constitution sound like a subjective poetry club rather than objective law?
It is a completely natural reaction for any legal mind to have, and it's a tension the book addresses directly. But Tsai argues that reason and faith are not mutually exclusive. They are totally synergistic.
Synergistic how?
Think about public reason and those hard, logical, objective rules you want as a lawyer. Those rules can only be engaged if everyone in the courtroom and everyone in society shares a baseline set of assumptions about our political existence.
Okay.
If there is no underlying faith in the intrinsic value of free speech, the technical rules simply collapse. Legal rights don't naturally occur in the wild. You can't just mine them out of the ground.
Right. They are human-made.
They are created and perpetuated by society to protect things we collectively value. Without a culture that genuinely reveres those rights, a community of faith, the parchment in Washington is worthless.
So the faith is the psychological foundation that allows the mechanical rules to even function in the real world.
Exactly. And a perfect high-stakes illustration of this is the famous Pentagon Papers case, New York Times v. U.S.
Oh, 1971.
Right. The Nixon administration tried to stop major newspapers from publishing classified leaked documents about the history of the Vietnam War. It was this unprecedented clash between national security and press freedom.
And the Supreme Court ruled against the government, allowing the papers to publish.
They did, but if you actually read the decision, the justices completely fractured on the exact doctrinal rules. They issued a brief, unsigned per curiam opinion, and then every single justice wrote their own separate opinion.
Wait, really? They couldn't agree on the math, so to speak?
Not at all. Justice Hugo Black was a textual absolutist. He basically said the First Amendment says no law, which means no censorship, ever, period. National security be damned.
Wow, okay.
And then Justice Brennan was more nuanced, saying prior restraint is only okay in incredibly narrow circumstances, like if publication inevitably and immediately imperils a transport ship at sea.
A much tighter rule.
Right. Then Justice Stewart focused less on speech and more on the executive branch's lack of specific statutory regulations from Congress. And Justice White pragmatically admitted the publication would probably do serious damage to national interests, but he still sided with the press.
Why?
Because he fundamentally believed in the long-term structural value of a free press exposing government secrets.
So they are all over the map doctrinally. I mean, if you were a law student trying to find the one true legal test from that case, you were just out of luck.
But that is Tsai's exact point. They couldn't agree on the specific legal test, but they all rallied around the exact same core civic faith.
Which is the absolute necessity of robust debate and an informed public to keep a democracy alive.
Precisely. They all worshipped at the same altar of the First Amendment, even if they bitterly disagreed on the specific liturgy. It proves that the underlying cultural belief, the shared vocabulary of freedom, is actually stronger and more unifying than the technical legal rules.
Okay, so if we are operating in this civic religion, we need to look at the actual scripture being preached. We need to look at the specific words.
Yes, moving from why we believe to how we enforce it.
Exactly. This moves us from why we believe in these rights to the exact linguistic tools we use to enforce them. We are talking about the architecture of metaphor, how words literally build worlds.
This is where the book integrates the cognitive science of language, drawing heavily on the foundational work of linguists like George Lakoff and Mark Johnson.
Right.
They argue that metaphor is not just a stylistic flourish or poetry we use to make writing sound pretty. Metaphor is the fundamental structural way human beings understand complex, abstract concepts.
And we have to differentiate between first-order metaphors and second-order metaphors here.
Let's define them.
First-order metaphors are just basic communication, like the container metaphor.
Yeah.
We constantly say things like, he couldn't get his ideas across to me, or her thoughts were empty, or I put a lot into that argument.
Right.
We subconsciously conceptualize abstract ideas as physical objects inside a container. It is so basic to human cognition, we don't even realize we are doing it.
You literally couldn't communicate without first-order metaphors. But constitutional law relies on something much more powerful. Second-order metaphors.
Second-order metaphors.
Yes. These are specialized, highly intentional, regime-building tools. Think of phrases you hear all the time in political speeches. The bulwark of liberty, or the fabric of our society, or a shining city on a hill.
These do incredibly heavy lifting for the state.
They really do. They legitimize state authority, they promote a sense of national fellowship, and crucially, they level the Constitution.
Level it.
Yeah, because the law is filled with incredibly dense, elite, arcane concepts. Second-order metaphors take all that complexity and compress it into vivid imagery that everyday people can instantly understand, visualize, and rally behind.
You know, listening to you explain these second-order metaphors, it sounds exactly like downloading a software update for a society's operating system.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Right. Once a judge or a politician successfully installs, say, the Marketplace of Ideas patch, our brains are permanently rewired to process all future free speech questions through the lens of buying, selling, and market competition.
Yes.
It fundamentally changes the back-end code of how we evaluate truth.
That software analogy actually perfectly maps onto size theory. Once the software is installed, it runs in the background automatically, coloring every decision. And the book gives us some incredibly potent examples of this software in action.
Let's hear one.
Let's look at the late Justice Antonin Scalia, who was a master of rhetorical framing. Specifically, his famous use of the culture war metaphor.
Ah, yes. This was heavily utilized in Romer v. Evans in the mid-90s, and later in Lawrence v. Texas in 2003. These were landmark cases dealing with the rights of sexual minorities.
In his dissenting opinions in both of those cases, Scalia vehemently argued that the Supreme Court should not intervene to strike down anti-gay laws. And the primary tool he used to make his argument wasn't just dry legal precedent.
It was the powerful second-order metaphor of a culture war.
Exactly. He wrote that the court was departing from its proper role as a neutral, objective observer and was actively taking sides in a culture war, aligning itself with the elite lawyer class against the values of the common people.
Man, by framing homosexuality and the debate over gay rights as a culture war, the metaphor does so much subconscious heavy lifting.
Think about the connotations of the word war.
Right. A war implies violence. It implies two equally matched sides fighting for ultimate dominance. It implies there will inevitably be casualties.
And most importantly, for his legal argument, what does it imply?
It implies that the courts, like a neutral nation like Switzerland, should stay entirely out of the bloodshed and let the combatants fight it out in the political trenches.
It is a brilliantly constructed populist appeal cloaked in legal reasoning. The software update of the culture war metaphor tells the listener, politics is combat. Let the Democratic majority fight it out at the ballot box, and any judicial intervention to protect a minority is an undemocratic elite power grab.
Wow. Whether you agree with his legal conclusion or not, you have to admire the raw, persuasive power of the linguistic framing. It reframes the minority, not as vulnerable citizens needing constitutional protection, but as aggressive combatants in a zero-sum war.
Exactly. Now let's look at another one which is wildly visual and has a very long history. The fire metaphor.
The fire metaphor. This traces back to Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, right?
Right, who famously cautioned against tolerating radical expression that acts like a little breath that could kindle a flame. This fire imagery became an incredibly powerful tool for government suppression. Look at the 1925 case Gitlow v. New York.
This was during the Red Scare. Benjamin Gitlow was a socialist who was arrested for distributing left-wing revolutionary pamphlets called the Left-Wing Manifesto.
Yes.
But he wasn't actually plotting a specific bombing or anything. He was just handing out literature advocating for mass strikes and class action.
But the Supreme Court upheld his criminal conviction, and the majority opinion used the fire metaphor to devastating, almost terrifying effect. They wrote that a single revolutionary spark may kindle a fire that could burst into a sweeping and destructive conflagration.
Therefore, they argued, the state doesn't have to wait for the fire to actually start blazing. It has the right to stomp out the spark immediately before any real danger occurs.
The metaphor basically short-circuits rational mathematical analysis.
Completely. If you tell people there is a spark sitting next to a powder keg, they don't stop to calculate the exact statistical probability of an explosion. They panic, their survival instinct kicks in, and they grab a bucket of water.
The metaphor becomes the legal test. You don't have to prove actual danger, you just have to invoke the imagery of fire.
The visual of the state acting as a heroic firefighter putting out a dangerous blaze completely legitimizes the suppression of dissenting speech. It makes censorship look like a vital public safety service.
But metaphors aren't just used to destroy rights. They can also build impenetrable fortresses around them. Look at the 1969 case, Stanley v. Georgia.
Oh, this is a fascinating turn.
Yeah.
This is the case where police got a warrant to search a man's home looking for evidence of illegal bookmaking.
Yeah.
They didn't find any gambling stuff, but in his bedroom drawer, they found obscene films. So they arrested him for possessing obscenity.
And you have to remember, obscenity has historically enjoyed zero First Amendment protection. So Stanley was in serious trouble. But the Supreme Court ruled in his favor.
And they didn't do it by fundamentally altering the complex, messy legal definitions of what constitutes obscenity, did they?
Nope. Instead, they deployed a powerful boundary metaphor, the home as a castle. Justice Thurgood Marshall wrote the opinion, and he framed it by saying that the Constitution rebels at the thought of giving government the power to control men's minds in the privacy of their own homes.
They pivoted the entire conversation. It wasn't about, is this movie obscene or not? It became this massive anti-totalitarian rallying cry.
State regulation in the home equals mind control.
They installed the anti-totalitarian Home as Castle software update. By contrasting the sanctity and privacy of the home with the terrifying specter of Orwellian mind control, the court secured immense social support for what could have been a very unpopular ruling.
It made protecting a guy's right to watch dirty movies in his bedroom feel like a patriotic defense against fascism. The metaphor was the shield.
We've seen how these metaphors work in isolation, how they function as individual patches of code. But how do entire systems of these metaphors rise to power, dominate the cultural conversation for decades, and then eventually collapse?
To understand the macro view, the book says we have to look at the life cycle of a linguistic regime.
Okay, let's get into the life cycle.
And to set that up, Tsai starts by shattering another beloved, romanticized legal myth, the myth of Brandenburg v. Ohio.
This is the holy grail case for First Amendment purists. It's a 1969 case involving the Ku Klux Klan.
Right. A Klan leader named Clarence Brandenburg held a rally on a farm, complete with burning crosses and racial slurs, and made vague threats of revengeance against the government.
He was convicted under an Ohio criminal syndicalism law.
But the Supreme Court struck down his conviction, ruling that the government cannot punish inflammatory speech unless that speech is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action.
Lawyers and law professors often teach Brandenburg as the glorious climax of the First Amendment, right? The moment the law finally worked itself pure and achieved perfect objective rationality, stripping away all the emotional biases of the past.
It's taught like the grand finale of a long movie where the hero finally figures it all out. But Tsai says that is a complete fairy tale.
Really, a fairy tale.
He calls it a civic creation myth. It presents a neat, linear story of progressive enlightenment that completely ignores the messy, contradictory, and deeply political currents of history that actually produced the ruling.
So the law didn't just magically become perfectly rational in 1969.
The justices didn't just get smarter. Instead, what happened was the culmination of a specific linguistic regime that had been building for decades.
Let's clearly define what a linguistic regime is. Tsai describes it as a relatively stable union of rhetorical practice, political tenets, and legal rules over a period of time. And it goes through 4 distinct stages.
Composition, reaction, adaptation, and breakdown.
To really grasp this, let's trace the life cycle of the most famous metaphor in American law, the marketplace of ideas. Because this concept didn't just fall out of the sky fully formed.
No, it started with Justice Holmes again, right? In his 1919 dissent in a case called Abrams, he talked about the best test of truth being the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. He essentially called for free trade in ideas.
Okay, so that is the composition stage. Holmes invents and introduces the new vocabulary.
But it doesn't take over the world immediately. It enters the reaction stage. Over the following decades, society reacts to it, tests it in lower courts, politicians use it in speeches.
And what happens is that this specific metaphor perfectly captured the rising American zeitgeist of the 20th century. It brilliantly, seamlessly merged our rising belief in laissez-faire economic capitalism with our principles of free speech.
The software update was highly compatible with the American operating system. Ideas suddenly become commodities. Citizens are conceptualized as rational buyers and sellers navigating a market.
And the state.
The state is recast as the heavy-handed, inefficient regulator who shouldn't be interfering with pricing and market forces.
And once society largely accepts that economic framing, the metaphor enters the adaptation stage, where it becomes the dominant way courts and citizens solve almost all free speech problems.
The state's role shrinks drastically to simply keeping the market open and preventing monopolies of force. And what's fascinating is that as a new linguistic regime takes over, existing metaphors can actually flip their meaning to serve the new regime. Think back to the fire metaphor.
Oh, the one used to throw socialists in jail in the 1920s by stomping out the spark.
Right. Post-WWII, as the American linguistic regime shifted towards a deep anti-totalitarian, pro-freedom stance, the fire metaphor flipped completely.
Down.
Instead of dissenting speech being the dangerous fire that must be extinguished, speech became the vital democratic flame that keeps the republic warm. And the state's aggressive laws became a dangerous cold front.
Oh, wow.
This gave birth to a brand new phrase that we still use constantly today, the chilling effect.
That is incredible. Overbroad laws have a chilling effect on the democratic fire. The exact same root metaphor, temperature, and fire reversed its polarity to protect speech instead of suppressing it, just because the overarching linguistic regime had changed.
This entire linguistic regime model is Tsai's direct critique of other major constitutional theories, particularly Bruce Ackerman's theory of dualism.
Remind me what dualism is.
Ackerman argues that the Constitution only fundamentally changes during incredibly rare moments of higher lawmaking driven by a highly mobilized public like the founding, Reconstruction, or the New Deal. He views these as informal constitutional amendments.
Or you have the gradualists, who think the law just slowly, mechanically inches forward case by case, like a glacier moving down a mountain.
Tsai argues both of those views are inadequate. The linguistic regime model shows that profound, sweeping constitutional change happens constantly, right in front of us, through the shifting of vocabulary and metaphors.
You don't need a formal Article V amendment, and you don't need a singular mythical moment of higher lawmaking. It is an ongoing, everyday cultural negotiation. Okay, if the marketplace of ideas is the ultimate dominant regime right now, I have a major question.
Go for it.
Why does it feel like it has so many disastrous blind spots today? If we treat speech literally like capitalism, don't the richest speakers naturally create a monopoly on truth?
Yeah.
If you are a billionaire, you can buy the megaphones, you can buy the algorithms, and you drown out the average citizen.
Yeah.
Does the marketplace metaphor actually hurt democracy in the digital age?
You are describing the exact vulnerability of any linguistic regime. It eventually enters the fourth stage, breakdown. The marketplace metaphor was composed with the assumption that all ideas have an equal chance to be heard, and that human consumers are perfectly rational actors who will always buy the objective truth if given the choice.
Which we know isn't true.
Right. As you just pointed out, market failures exist in reality. Monopolies exist. Predatory pricing exists. Cognitive biases exist.
Disinformation campaigns generated by foreign states or AI bots on social media are basically toxic, unregulated products flooding the market, poisoning the consumers.
And when a linguistic regime can no longer adequately explain or manage the lived social reality, it begins to fracture and break down. We are arguably living through that exact breakdown stage right now.
We are seeing it in real time.
You can see scholars, tech leaders, and activists frantically trying to compose new metaphors to replace the pure free market approach. Some are testing out metaphors focused on public health, treating bad speech like a virus. Others are talking about democratic infrastructure.
The language is currently in a state of chaotic flux as we wait for the next regime to take hold. So, if this marketplace metaphor is breaking down, it begs the question, who gets to write the replacement? Is it just 9 judges sitting in mahogany chambers dreaming up new poetry? Or do ordinary citizens have the power to hack the system?
This explores how social movements and political pathways actually rewrite the syntax of our rights. And this is perhaps the most empowering part of the book.
How so?
Psy focuses on how two entirely different grassroots social movements from opposite ends of the political spectrum successfully manipulated First Amendment syntax to achieve their goals. Let's look first at the civil rights movement in the 1960s.
Okay, because the legal and physical challenge they faced was massive. Activists were engaging in sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, boycotts, and mass marches through hostile cities. But historically, how did the Southern courts and the white establishment view large groups of unpermitted black citizens gathering in the streets?
They viewed them through a very specific, suppressive linguistic lens. They were instantly labeled a mob. Or, at best, they were categorized as a dangerous disruption to traffic and a threat to public order and commerce. The prevailing legal syntax of the time offered absolutely no protection from mass, disruptive street action. If you were blocking a sidewalk, you were breaking the law. End of story.
So how did civil rights leaders rewrite the code?
Activists, and eventually sympathetic lawyers and judges, systematically deployed what Psy calls the meeting metaphor.
The meeting metaphor.
They took the chaotic, physically disruptive reality of a street protest and rhetorically reframed it as an idealized, highly patriotic, peaceable assembly.
Oh, they took the imagery of a traditional democratic New England town hall meeting and just moved it to the asphalt.
Yes. Through a series of landmark cases like Garner, Edwards, Cox, and Brown v. Louisiana, the Supreme Court absorbed this new vocabulary.
Oh, wow.
In the Edwards case, which involved a massive protest at the South Carolina State House, the court literally described the marching and singing as an exercise of First Amendment rights in their most pristine and classic form.
By shifting the vocabulary away from mob or riot and toward assembly and meeting, they forced the law to grant these protests the absolute highest level of First Amendment protection.
They hijacked the patriotic nostalgia of the Founding Fathers gathering to debate the future of the country, and they successfully applied that exact same reverence to black college students sitting silently at a Woolworth's lunch counter.
That is an incredible rhetorical hack. And then the book contrasts this with a completely different movement a few decades later, social conservatives in the 1980s and 90s.
Right. For decades following the landmark 1947 case Everson, the absolute dominant metaphor for the religion clauses of the First Amendment was Thomas Jefferson's famous phrase, a wall of separation between church and state.
It was the ultimate boundary metaphor. The idea was that the wall kept religion safe from government interference and kept government safe from religious strife.
But conservatives felt that the wall was actually being used as a weapon to push religion entirely out of the public square, marginalizing people of faith.
So what do they do?
They launched a sustained, multi-decade attack on the wall metaphor. And this is key. They didn't try to pass a constitutional amendment to change the text. Instead, they systematically shifted the vocabulary.
Oh.
They argued that maintaining the wall wasn't an act of neutrality. It was an act of hostility and animus against religion.
They flipped the script. They said, you aren't protecting us with a wall. You are actively discriminating against us by locking us out.
Exactly. They introduced a brand new syntax centered on equal access and viewpoint discrimination. Their argument was, if a public university funds a secular student newspaper, it must fund a religious student newspaper.
Okay, I see.
To deny funding to the religious group isn't maintaining a wall of separation. It is engaging in illegal viewpoint discrimination. You see this linguistic shift triumph in cases like Rosenberger and Levy-Wiseman.
The protective wall was rhetorically dismantled and reframed as a weapon of discriminatory hostility.
Both of these movements, civil rights activists and social conservatives, basically bypassed the formal amendment process entirely. They changed the Constitution without changing a single word of the text.
They seem to prove Larry Kramer's idea of popular constitutionalism, where the people themselves hold the final, ultimate authority on what the Constitution means.
Psy agrees with Kramer to an extent, acknowledging the power of the people, but he adds a critical nuance. It's not just raw majority rule or pure popular constitutionalism. It is an amalgamation.
Meaning?
The social movements creates the raw pressure, the grievances, and the initial language. But it requires legal elites, lawyers, and judges to refine that raw social language into workable doctrinal rules that fit within the precepts of eloquence.
It's a necessary collaboration between the passion of the streets and the logic of the courts.
Exactly.
This brings up another huge concern for me.
Let's hear it.
If social movements can fundamentally rewrite the Constitution's meaning, just by successfully hacking its vocabulary. Doesn't that mean our constitutional rights are incredibly fragile? Does a right only exist as long as your PR campaign is successful?
That is the big fear.
Right. If a new movement comes along tomorrow with a catchier metaphor and a better marketing budget, do my fundamental rights just vanish into thin air?
It is the terrifying, unavoidable reality of a living constitution. Yes, rights are fragile. They do not exist in a vacuum, independent of the culture that sustains them.
Which goes back to the faith idea.
Exactly. If a society stops speaking the language of a particular right, if it abandons the metaphors that uphold it, that right will wither and die, regardless of what the parchment in the National Archives says. The text is just a starting point.
But Tsai would argue this fragility is actually a feature, not a bug, wouldn't he?
Yes, he would. It prevents society from becoming paralyzed. It forces every single generation to actively defend, debate, and re-articulate their values, rather than relying lazily on the dead hand of the past to protect them.
Every generation has to win the argument all over again, using their own words. And grassroots movements aren't the only ones who can rewrite the constitutional code. Sometimes it takes the ultimate bully pulpit, the presidency, combined with the existential pressure of a global crisis to rewire our brains.
Oh, this is a great part of the book.
Which takes us to one of the most stunning, rapid reversals in Supreme Court history. We are looking at a 3-year window between 1940 and 1943.
We are talking about the mandatory school flag salute cases. In 1940, the court decided Minersville School District v. Gobitis.
Golbetis.
2 young Jehovah's Witness children were expelled from their public school in Pennsylvania for refusing to salute the American flag and recite the pledge, which their religion considered a form of idolatry.
And the Supreme Court in 1940 ruled against the kids. They
Yeah.
said the state could force them to salute.
In an 8-1 opinion written by Justice Felix Frankfurter, to understand why, you have to remember the context of 1940. Hitler is marching across Europe, the world is at war, and America is terrified of being dragged in.
So fear is the dominant emotion.
Frankfurter's rhetoric in the opinion focused heavily on national cohesion and self-protection. The prevailing linguistic regime of that perilous moment dictated that national unity was the ultimate foundation of a free society, and therefore the state could lawfully coerce a symbolic salute to maintain that necessary unity against foreign threats.
But then President Franklin D. Roosevelt steps up to the microphone.
FDR didn't intervene in the court cases directly. He didn't file an amicus brief or threaten the justices. Instead, he initiated a massive nationwide project to reshape the cultural syntax through his public addresses, most notably his famous Four Freedoms speech.
Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear.
FDR framed America as the arsenal of democracy. He fundamentally defined American identity in direct, stark opposition to the totalitarianism, fascism, and coerced uniformity of our enemies abroad.
He made a powerful cultural argument.
Yes, that if we are fighting a global war against regimes that force their people to conform and salute, our greatest strength, our defining characteristic, must be our tolerance for individual dissent.
He flooded the cultural ecosystem with this new anti-totalitarian vocabulary. He gave the country a new way to speak about itself. And the Supreme Court was listening to the radio just like everyone else.
They definitely were.
Just 3 years later, in 1943, the exact same issue comes back to the court in West Virginia Board of Education v. Barnett.
And the court completely reversed itself. Justice Robert Jackson wrote one of the most famous, eloquent opinions in American legal history. He entirely absorbed FDR's anti-totalitarian rhetoric.
He completely rejected Frankfurter's argument for coerced unity.
Jackson famously declared, "If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion,
Or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein." It is arguably the most beautiful sentence in constitutional law. But the underlying mechanics are fascinating. The syntax of war created a modernist consciousness, prioritizing individual confidence over state unity.
It is the war and syntax dynamic. The rhetoric we use to distinguish ourselves from our fascist enemies physically altered the interpretation of the First Amendment at home.
And what is really interesting is how this militarized language of liberty persists for decades, popping up in completely unrelated contexts.
Oh, absolutely. For example, jump ahead to the year 2000 in a case called Paps AM regarding local ordinances banning nude dancing.
New dancing.
Yeah. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, when arguing that this type of expression shouldn't get high-level protection, explicitly invoked military sacrifice, saying we don't march our sons and daughters off to war to protect this kind of expression.
It's like the president is the conductor of a massive cultural orchestra. The president doesn't play the instruments, he doesn't write the court opinions or file the briefs. But by changing the tempo, the mood, and the sheet music of the broader culture, he forces the musicians, the judges, to play a completely different song.
That analogy captures it perfectly. The legal notes on the page are the exact same, but the music sounds totally different. The president dictates the cultural key signature, and the court eventually has to harmonize with it, or they risk becoming completely illegitimate and out of touch in the eyes of the public.
We've seen citizens, activists, and presidents shape the language. Where does this leave the judge? If text is fluid and language is power, how should a judge actually do their job? When I go to court, what am I looking at up on that bench?
Tsai critiques two dominant models of judging that are popular today. First, the translation model, which says a judge's only job is to be a historian. They must mechanically translate the original intent of the founders into modern times without injecting any modern values.
And the second.
Second, the enforcement model, which envisions judges as saviors on white horses, riding in to aggressively strike down laws and rigidly enforce absolute rights against the tyranny of the Democratic majority.
Tai says both of those are flawed because they ignore how language works, right? He advocates for what he calls the facilitative model. What does a facilitative judge do?
The facilitative model argues that adjudication, the act of judging a case, should fundamentally be about mediating cultural conflict, managing political grammar, and cultivating civic ideals. The judge isn't a mechanic fixing a broken machine, and the judge isn't a savior.
The judge is a facilitator of the ongoing, never-ending democratic conversation.
To really grasp this, Tsai points to a legendary philosophical clash between Thomas Jefferson and James Madison regarding how a constitution should function.
Let's hear it.
Jefferson famously believed that the earth belongs to the living. He thought it was absurd to be governed by dead ancestors. He wanted constant, vibrant, generational revolution. He actually suggested the Constitution should automatically expire every 19 years so every new generation could rewrite it from scratch.
But Madison was terrified of that level of chaos. Madison feared the passions of the mob and the instability of constant revolution. He wanted institutional management, slow stability, and what Tsai calls strategic ambiguity.
Strategic ambiguity.
He deliberately wanted the text to be a little bit vague so it could bend over time without breaking.
Tsai argues that a mature constitutional system blends both of these visions. It takes Jefferson's demand for cultural vitality, relevance, and the energy of social movements, and it manages that raw energy through Madison's stable institutional frameworks.
Therefore, a judge shouldn't just try to kill a cultural conflict with a final, absolute, rigid ruling.
No, they shouldn't. They should take raw social passions like the civil rights movement or the conservative religious revival, and carefully translate them into the civilized, manageable language of constitutional debate. They synthesize the new vocabulary into the existing structure.
Let me throw one last challenge at you, because this goes to the heart of how everyday people view the courts. If a judge's job is just to facilitate conversation and mediate cultural grammar, aren't they basically just acting as politicians in robes?
People say that all the time.
When the average citizen goes to the Supreme Court, they don't want a debate moderator. They want an umpire. Chief Justice John Roberts famously said in his confirmation hearing that his job is just to call balls and strikes.
It's the most famous metaphor in modern legal history. But Tsai would argue that the umpire metaphor is itself a highly successful, deliberately constructed linguistic regime.
Wait, really?
It is a second-order metaphor designed specifically to hide the true, collaborative, messy, and highly political nature of constitutional law from the public. Think about it. Calling balls and strikes implies that there is a perfectly defined, objective, floating strike zone that exists independently of the umpire.
But as we've discussed for the past hour, the First Amendment strike zone is constantly shifting based on societal values, metaphors, grassroots protests, and presidential speeches.
The umpire metaphor creates a comforting illusion of mathematical objectivity, but the reality is that judges are active co-authors of the linguistic regime. They are helping to write the rules of the game while the game is being played.
That completely flips how I look at the Supreme Court. The umpire metaphor is just another piece of software we've installed in our brains to make ourselves feel better about the messy, subjective reality of democracy.
It gives us comfort, but it obscures the truth of how our rights actually function.
This has been an incredible journey. Let's do a comprehensive summary to bring this all home. Today, we took a deep dive into Robert Sai's Eloquence and Reason. We started by discarding the old pre-political myths of a static social contract.
We discovered that the First Amendment is not just a parchment barrier. It is a living, breathing linguistic regime.
We explored how it operates as a civic faith, requiring devotional practices and shared assumptions from all of us to even function.
We saw how second-order metaphors like the marketplace of ideas, the culture war, or the wall of separation are not just rhetorical decorations. They do the actual heavy lifting of governance, physically wiring our brains to view complex legal rights in very specific, predetermined ways.
And we saw the incredible power of the people. We learned how ordinary citizens marching in the streets during the civil rights movement and wartime presidents giving fireside chats can completely rewrite the constitutional syntax, forcing the Supreme Court to abandon old metaphors and adopt a new vocabulary.
Ultimately, the law is not a rigid structure that just happens to you. It is a language that you actively participate in speaking.
Which leads to our final takeaway for you, the listener. Your words genuinely matter. The way you speak about your rights in your daily life, the metaphors you accept from politicians on the news, the framing you choose to reject in arguments with your friends that ultimately determines the physical boundaries of your freedom.
You are a participant in writing the Constitution every single day, just by the vocabulary you choose to use. It is a profound and somewhat daunting civic responsibility.
And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own. We've established today that our constitutional rights are entirely dependent on a shared human vocabulary and cultural metaphors.
Right.
But what happens to the First Amendment in an era where language is increasingly generated by artificial intelligence?
Oh, that is a chilling, immediate question we have to face.
If algorithms begin to literally dictate the marketplace of ideas, and machine learning models moderate our speech, write our articles, and generate our news, will AI inadvertently compose the next linguistic regime of human rights?
Without us even knowing.
Exactly. If a machine dictates the metaphors we read every day, will it rewrite our constitutional syntax without us even realizing the new software update has been installed?
If Foucault is right, and our vocabulary is the monument of our thought, we have to look very closely at who or what is building the monument tomorrow.
It makes you wonder. We started today by talking about how looking for clear binary rights is like hoping for a clean medical x-ray in a situation that is hopelessly murky. But maybe the x-ray machine isn't broken at all. Maybe it's just taking a picture of something that isn't bone. It's taking a picture of our words, our metaphors, and our faith. And it's up to us to decide what that picture looks like. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us. We will see you next time.